Hello, everybody. This is the final panel of today. We're talking about open source in enterprise and open source adoption. We have, joining me, I'm Kevin Goldsmith. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Anaconda. And joining me are three of our strategic partners, or folks from three of our strategic partners. We have David Liu from Intel, Sri Chintala from Snowflake, and Hemanth Manda from IBM. Please take a seat. Now, I'm going to ask you, each of you, very briefly, just tell us a little bit about what you do. What's your day job? So let's start with you, David.
Hey, no problem. Name's David Liu. I'm a staff AI engineer at Intel. Work on hardware and software solutions for data science and AI.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sri Chintala. I'm a senior product manager at Snowflake, and I mostly focus on extensibility at Snowflake. And I'm working on a new developer experience called Snowpark, where we're trying to bring languages beyond SQL to Snowflake.
Hi, everyone. This is Hemanth Manda. I work for IBM. I manage and lead the strategic partnerships for data and AI, and been working with Anaconda for the past few months in terms of expanding our partnership.
Excellent. So each of you is representing, a fairly significant enterprise, working with some fairly significant enterprises, but also small and mid-sized businesses as well. What are you seeing about open source and how open source adoption, not only within your company and maybe how you've seen that change, but also from your customers, the attitude towards it? Whoever wants to start with this one.
Okay, I can go first. So I think in general, we've spoke about this quite a bit over the last few panels and yesterday. But in general, the number of open source tools and packages we have out there, because of the broad spectrum of that, both enterprises and market disruptors are able to move faster and more reliably than it was ever possible. So if there's a task I want to do, and if there exists a solution that's been battle tested, that's been there for a while, why would you reinvent the wheel? And because of this broad ecosystem of open source packages, not just developers, but especially in the data ecosystem, because that's what I most frequently work with most of my customers, all of the data teams are able to leverage this broad spectrum of tools and packages to expedite everything from building data pipelines to data applications. So it's amazing. And in general, even the mindset is changing. I think we'll get into this a little bit more. But enterprises obviously want more security, and developers want the agility to be able to use the packages out there to help do their development and complete their tasks in a quicker way. So there's this gray line and boundary about how do enterprises and how do developers use the open source packages and tools in a more secure fashion. And that's something we're together solving with the Anaconda team, and there's a lot of efforts going on. But yeah, in general, I think it's a great time where we're seeing enterprise adopt open source more and more. And in the same way, at Snowflake, we want Snowflake users to be able to use open source packages more as part of their day-to-day workloads, and that's exactly what we're enabling with the Anaconda partnership. As part of the Anaconda partnership, we're providing open source Python packages natively out of the box inside Snowflake. So with Snowpark for Python, which is the new developer experience we just launched, so if you want to bring your Python workloads that you were running outside of Snowflake, you can now do it in a seamless fashion. You just come in, bring your Python code, and tell us what packages you want. And because we've also integrated the Conda package manager into the development workflow, we automatically make it super seamless to use those packages. That's just one example, but in general, with Snowflake, we see people using dbt, Airflow, and also we had recent product integrations. Apart from Anaconda, we're partnering. We made Apache Iceberg format. We natively support Apache Iceberg. So we are trying to embrace the OSS ecosystem as much as we can, and also enable our users to do the same.
Yeah, I can add to what is being said here, right? I think one of the main reasons why enterprise customers are looking at open source is because of agility. I think open source, there's a misnomer out there that just because open source is free, everybody is flocking to it. I think it's not the freeness of open source, it's more about the agility and the community that brings that speed, right? Because time to market is extremely critical for enterprises, and that's why enterprises are embracing open source. The flip side of it is when an enterprise is looking at source code and trying to get that into production, they have to look into governance, they have to look into security, they also need to look into support, because if you have an open source community, if something goes wrong in your enterprise and you need to fix it in the next 6 to 7 hours or 1 to 2 hours, you can't go to a community and say, I need a fix, please give me the fix, right? So there's no accountability, which is where I think the commercialization of open source comes into picture. So I think there is a lot of opportunity here. And when I look at IBM, like 70 to 80% of our source code actually is open source, right? We do include open source packages. So it is becoming prevalent. And it's not just at IBM, right? Any company you look into, whether it's a cloud provider or whether it's an enterprise software provider, there is open source. The question is, how do we make sure that we're addressing the needs of both the developers as well as the enterprises?
I think one aspect of working in the open source space, and especially working at Intel, is it's a bit of a discovery process. I think it's still very early, and when we work with our end customers or our partners, it's still a space that we have to explore. Like, what aspects of open source are actually still changing today? Is, the definition of what people are requiring changing? Is it the understanding of how you're passing what was either something that was pure CapEx to OpEx? Is it a savings? What aspects of working with open source do our end customers have to learn about to understand how it affects their business? So in working with many of our partners and customers, it's still a discovery process for all of us, because we're still figuring out, this can actually save us money if we actually contribute to this project and fund them. Or, you're able to save one company's operational costs just by moving to open source, but also speccing a few of the heads to work in that particular community. So for Intel, I think it's still a very fun experience to start learning more about what open source means to just, I guess, the definition of it. And that's what's still exciting.
That was, I think, one of the key things that came out of the last panel is what exactly is open source, because there is such a range that it covers. I think it's interesting, especially hearing from these three companies, because it is a marked change on how enterprises address, or even address at all, open source. When I was at Microsoft a long time ago, we were not allowed to look at open source. We were not allowed to think about open source. We were definitely not allowed to contribute to open source. And you look at Microsoft, now was a few years ago, but you look at Microsoft now, and each of your companies, that wouldn't have, IBM wasn't doing anything in open source. Like, that would have been ludicrous. And now every one of your companies not only has to embrace it, but has to be an active participant just to be considered. One of the things that you brought up that I like is it's not just about the cost. It's nice to have free software. However, just the rate and pace of innovation that's happening in the open source world, especially in the data world, makes it impossible to not use it if you want to build competitive commercial products. Every one of your products takes advantage of that. What does that mean? And to follow up also on one thing that came up also in an earlier panel and came up in this, one of the challenges is you now have to embrace open source, but at the same time, security has become a problem. Before, when we weren't allowed to look at open source, it was about IP. It was about IP concerns. And now it's about security. I think one of the big challenges, and we've seen stuff even recently about security coming through the open source world. In the earlier panel, we heard maybe one set of opinions from a different set of companies. I have a feeling that it's a little bit different for IBM, Intel, and Snowflake. Let's talk a bit about open source security and what it means to your companies.
I think for Intel and a lot of our end customers, the software supply chain, especially, just even in AI, right? But just for all aspects of it, is a huge element that Intel and our end customers are thinking about.
I think at Snowflake, one of the biggest value props is obviously you can bring in your data, you can manage it and run it at scale. But the biggest reason people like Snowflake is the security and governance benefits, especially if you're coming from a regulated industry such as fintech or healthcare. It really matters the security and governance and who's accessing the data, and being able to have that levels of controls is what people like. And the biggest feedback we've been getting is before Snowpark and before we introduced support for Python and Java and other languages, obviously people wanted to write more complex business logic, and they had to move their data out of Snowflake, and they were managing and running additional systems where they were doing this other processing. And the biggest feedback is, mostly for the security and governance benefits, we would like our data to be in one place. That's one thing, like just to give you an idea of what even prompted us to go down this path about why are we bringing the Python and the Python ecosystem to Snowflake, is we've heard that feedback from customers. We want to be able to do more, but in a secure fashion. So that was one nudge. And the second thing, to go into a little bit more about open source and security. So today we're partnering with Anaconda, and we're providing Python packages out of the box inside Snowflake. So it's already a curated set of packages that we're providing from Anaconda. It's built on Anaconda build systems. And this is a little bit differentiated. And the reason we chose to do this is when we're looking at, hey, we want to go host Python, we want to allow users to bring Python code into Snowflake. There were two pain points. One was, I think everybody who works with Python probably dealt with this, is how do we make it simpler to work with packages? How do you make it simple to manage all the dependencies that come with working with Python projects? And the second biggest pain point was security. So a lot of, again, goes back to the agility between what developers want to use versus the security. If you're downloading packages off any random repository, or even Pipey is super popular, but there are a lot of typo squatting attacks that happen, and enterprises are concerned about that, and they want to have a little bit more control over what their developers use. And we've heard that feedback, and we try to do something differentiated this year. Hey, we want to give you a broad set of packages. Like we're not restricting users to 10 or 20. We're giving you a good set of curated packages that Anaconda team has gone through and has vetted, and it's built on Anaconda's build systems. And the second thing is, all of these packages and the Python code you're bringing is running in a secure sandbox inside Snowflake. So there is no external access. Your developers are not able to kind of reach out to any random endpoint and download any packages. So this levels of scrutiny and controls are based on enterprise feedback. So I can definitely tell you that for enterprise customers and organizations, security is top of mind. And that's exactly kind of what's prompting us to build more secure products and make sure we're not just bringing open source to the data, but bringing open source to production data in a secure fashion, and making sure people embrace open source in a secure fashion and move faster.
Yeah, I think same here, right? I think security is extremely important, because that's the value that we sell to our customers, that we are essentially making sure that we are backing the software that we provide to our customers, and we are liable, right? I mean, if you look at the terms and conditions that our customers, I think we sign to our customers, if something happens, we are essentially responsible for it. We are legally liable for it. In terms of security, right, the security challenge is there for open source. It's also there for proprietary software. So it begs the question as to, should open source be more secure? Are there bigger concerns with open source versus proprietary? It's an interesting question. I heard both sides of the equation. This is what I would say, right? Going back to my earlier comment, the beauty of open source is extremely fast. There's a lot of community, so the progress and the speed and the acceleration is significant. That also brings up the issue around security, because if an issue is identified, everybody knows about it. So unless you react quickly and fix it very quickly, you are at risk. And enterprises typically are a bit slow because they have processes in place, and try to basically get that fix addressed across your enterprise takes time. So I think that's the challenge with open source. That's why it gets highlighted around the security concerns, and I think we as a community need to address that.
I think one angle that's kind of interesting to view it from as a manufacturer is a lot of the work that I'm doing, and a lot of the groups that I work inside Intel are doing are looking at the hardware implications of security with open source. I don't think that's something that's really talked about today. That question, does open source influence hardware design? It does, right? It affects the partners like you two that, that my company works with, and it affects our end customers and the organizations that they work for. So I think that's the element that I'm going to start looking for in the future of kind of both hardware and software design. I think manufacturers are going to step up to the plate and start looking at this more seriously.
Oh, yeah, the manufacturing and the hardware aspect is, of course, very, very interesting. There was something that you each brought up in this last discussion. I think is actually really interesting. Talking about security, especially at the enterprise. One, you're absolutely right. Like open source versus proprietary. The benefit we say around security and open source is, many eyes, many hands. Everything is visible. So security issues will be immediately found. The other side of that is there is such an abundance. If you look at the number of packages that get installed just to do people's work, it's just a huge amount of them, which means that the shape of the attack surface is so massive. That stuff does get found, not always that quickly. And to your point as well, enterprises and enterprise governance means that sometimes it's very hard to replace it. Now, given that, and given that you're each kind of working with enterprises that are talking to you and they're very interested. We're very interested in Watson. We're very interested in Snowflake. What are the things that you've mentioned, Shri, some of the things you hear from customers? Like, is there very specific things that they talk to you about your use of open source or using open source with your tools? I think Snowflake did something really interesting around security in that it's completely sandboxed, right? The Snowpark is sandboxed, which means that Snowflake is completely decided everything that you're going to have access to. And that embedding model gives a nice layer of security, but not everybody can do that in their products, right? It's a significant investment to make that work. What do you hear though from your customers? You're specifically like, what are their concerns around your use of open source in your products or using your tools?
So I think in general, so already, like I said, we are, like Kevin mentioned, the sandbox has been a significant piece of investment because security is forefront of all of Snowflake's design principles. But in spite of that, now that we are in public preview and people are using Snowpark for Python and are able to use all of these packages, they do understand all of this comes from a curated set. But in general, what I've seen is, especially from the larger organizations, enterprises, where they're used to having the IT manage a centralized repository, they would still like to have further granular access about who gets to use what package. So even though we're not bringing in the full ocean, we're providing a curated set of packages. I think one of the feedback we've heard is they would like to have more granular control over what packages are being used in which accounts, which even to the level of which UDFs. And that kind of shows you of how concerned people are about in general about open source packages. And some of them even have daily process. So the way they work is they have these centralized repositories where they scan the metadata every day, and depending on the CV score, they either leave the package there, or if it does not meet the bar, the package gets pulled, and the developers locally can only use those set of packages, and they want to bring those same level of controls to wherever they use Python, let it be Snowflake, let it be elsewhere. So that's one thing I've heard, like, hey, how do I get even more granular access? We do understand it's running in a sandbox, but if there's a CV score, I would like to be able to have the control to say my developers cannot use that.
Hemanth?
Yeah, so I think I would repeat, right, the three critical things we keep on hearing from customers: security, governance, and then support. I think one of the things that is fascinating about open source is, again, I think enterprises are lagging when it comes to actual adoption. Yesterday, I think I was talking to Travis and Gerard. Apparently, JPMC is running on Python 2.7. I don't follow Python, but I know for a fact that we are like beyond 2.7. So I think for those customers, it's extremely critical, right, that support is taken care of, even though they're on an older version. For a number of reasons, they cannot go to the latest and greatest, but they still need to be supported. The other thing I hear from customers, I mean, we interact with customers across the world, North America, Europe, etc. There are customers in certain geos, such as Europe, who are not yet completely on board with Python. They still run Java and C++ packages. So I think when we are looking at the offerings that we are providing, right, trying to support those other modes and other source codes as well would be helpful. So expanding the scope of open source, not just to Python, but beyond Python would be helpful.
I think one thing that I guess I'm starting to see in a lot of my customer engagements is requirement for provenance in multiple formats. Everything from, you know, the identity of who created the packages, all the way down to how the model was created. Was there bias in your data set? You know, did you do a due diligence model? All aspects of that are coming from both the industry, regulated industries, and I think we're going to have to adapt as a community to that. And I guess from my perspective, that's where it's interesting hearing, you know, what you know, Snowflake and IBM are talking about, but also from the manufacturer side, seeing a completely different problem that we're going to have to work together to solve.
Yeah, the chain of custody, but also the chain of authorship. And theoretically, we should all know it because it's GitHub commits and it's all, you would think that metadata all exists, but I can say, you know, from us in our package building, sometimes that's actually really hard to track down, is which you get a CV and you're trying to track down which commit created that CV, and you find out, oh, well, this part actually is on GitHub, but this part came from GitLab, and this part came from, I don't know, somebody emailed a floppy disk back in 1997 or something. Yeah.
It feels a bit reactionary. It's like nobody cared about security or open source, and then when people started caring about security, they looked at open source, and then open source is like, you guys have been ignoring us for a long time, right?
One thing I thought was also interesting that you brought up, Sri, so we deal with, you know, these kind of governance problems, and we see this from our customers all the time, but normally you think about governance and in the terms of the data, not so much in terms of the packages. Like at a corporate level, yes, we want to make sure you're only using these packages, but you're actually starting to see people say, we want developers, this set of developers having access to these packages, and this set of developers only having access to these packages within a company.
Correct. And I think there's a little bit nuance there. So probably some of these requests are coming from the sandbox or development environments versus production environments. I think for the developer environments, they probably will have a little bit more flexibility on what packages get used to do some of the prototyping and testing. But with production workloads, especially where they're working with production data, I think there's a little bit more sensitivity. There's the whole, the data governance aspect, obviously, that's always there, that's going to be there about who has access to data. But even what packages are being used on that data is also apparently very important, especially I was just talking to a customer in a healthcare industry, and they have very strict protocols on what packages and what level of CV scores is acceptable to be used as part of their systems. And we need to be able to satisfy those requirements for them to be able to embrace that open source package as part of their workloads.
Let's look forward a little bit and think about kind of the evolution that we've gotten to over the last few years with how enterprises embrace or even sponsor open source, and where you think that's maybe going to go. So we've had a general kind of a big opening and a big embracing of open source, and now we're starting to see a little bit of headwinds just around the security aspect today. How do you see things changing? How do you see specifically in your companies? Are you going to continue and grow your open source engagements, your use of open source software, or are you finding maybe a different path? We'll start with you, Hemanth.
Yeah, so I think the journey towards open source, right, embracing open source, I don't think it's reversible. It's irreversible. So I don't think we have a choice. So we have an option. At least from an IBM perspective, we are expanding day by day, right? I think, as I said, right now, if I were to guess, 70 to 80% of our software includes open source. So it is a core tenet of what we're doing, and it's only going to get it'll increase. Obviously, we need to work through the governance, the management, the support, security, all these aspects, right, we have to take care of. And that would entail additional investments, partnering, embracing the community, and getting more involved with the community. So some of those things will evolve, but I don't think we would go back on open source.
How about you, Shri?
I definitely echo Hemanth's sentiment. I think there's no going back, and I think it's for a good reason. There's only good coming out of having people crowdsource and bring innovation to the table versus have just one set of best engineers contribute to proprietary software. And in terms of Snowflake's investment, I just touched upon it briefly. I think we're going to continue to embrace open source, and in fact, we consider ourselves part of the community. And as part of the Snowpark Python launch, we recently open sourced our Snowpark Python API. And when I say open source, we meant we want to accept contributions from the community, and it's great, right? We want if there's a company who builds a cool visualization tool on top of our software, we want to be able to have other users leverage that, and we already saw the first wave of contributions come in, which is great. And the other point I wanted to make is I think, especially with respect to data, the types of data we work with are only going to get complicated as time passes. And that's, again, where I see the open source community at how fast it's innovating. It's completely going to help how people can make sense of this data and get insights out of this data more rapidly. So, yeah, I think we'll continue to embrace open source, and it's an exciting journey ahead.
I think from our perspective, a lot of our greatest successes were built on open source, and again, we're not going to walk that back. If anything, we have to move with the community. I think one aspect is you can participate in open source, but if you do not listen to the community and what they're asking from you, then that can sometimes toss you in the wrong direction. So a lot of aspects about the work I do is making sure that that stays on track at the company.
Do you think eventually I'll have my own home fab in my garage, like next to a 3D printer? I'll be able to like download Intel.
You can always project yourself.
All right, there we go. So just a couple of minutes left. I just also wanted to give each of you just a chance, your closing thoughts, what you personally think, like what you're excited about in this new world that we're in, especially around data and open source, and thoughts for everybody here. We'll go with reverse order this time. So back to you, David.
No problem. I think for me, in closing, I think the open source community and all of the aspects of security that we just talked about are at the top of my mind for what I'm thinking about doing next with hardware design and software design, and as AI product designer. So I'm really excited to continue working with the community, and we'll be able to give back in both hardware and software and products.
For me, I think I touched upon this briefly, but what's very exciting is data is going to continue to evolve, and we're going to have more different types of data, more complicated data, and it's going to be very exciting to see how the open source community is going to help get insights out of that. And the second thing is the security aspect, which was a lot of our conversation today. Is I think that's one problem we've not yet solved. Like, how do we get developers the agility they need, but also satisfy the requirements of the IT and the enterprise organization? So I think that's something we'll continue to work towards and make sure we're allowing developers to move fast, but in a secure fashion.
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it is open source is the future. So it has got a lot of power, but with great power comes great responsibility. So I think as we move forward, I think that's something that we need to think about and work through, right? Because flexibility and freeness is good, but then too much of anything will create problems. So having a structure, having governance, right? Especially with the explosion of open source. So there needs to be quite a bit of effort needed from a community perspective to ensure that we are taking care of the complexity and simplifying it for consumption, and also making it secure so that bad actors cannot misuse it.
So I want to thank each of you for your insights and for sharing your knowledge. And I'm absolutely looking forward to being able to Conda install Snowflake on my IBM Z or on my Xeon cluster in the near future. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.